Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in European Studies. I'm Tim Jones, and my guest today is Lucy Kinski, author of European Representation in EU National Parliaments, published this year by Palgrave Macmillan, and shortlisted for the UAC's Best Book in European Studies Prize for 2021. The winner will be announced in the first week of September. It's been 44 years since the young European federalists first coined the term democratic deficit, 2 years before the first direct elections to the European Parliament, 10 years before the Single European Act, and more than 20 before the advent of the euro. Over those years, as the single market and the new currency shifted powers from the nation to the Union, the conviction that the EU suffers such a deficit has taken root among Europhiles and Eurosceptics alike. While powers have ceded, they say, democratic accountability has not. But is this entirely true? And if it is, should the deficit be filled by the European Parliament? In her new book, Dr. Kinski concludes that not only do national parliaments have a stronger claim to democratic legitimacy than the overarching supranational tier, but also that many national MPs are already acting as representatives for the wider union. Lucy Kinski is a researcher and lecturer at the Salzburg Center for European Union Studies. She studied at the Hertie School in Berlin, the Utrecht School of Economics, the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and obtained a doctorate at the University of Vienna. Before Salzburg, she was a senior researcher at the University of Düsseldorf. Lucy, thanks a lot for coming onto the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Well, in the introduction, I gave a one-sentence summary of the book's theme. Could you start by setting out a fuller summary of your argument and also of your method?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start by saying a bit more about how the book came about as well. So my broader academic interest revolves around representation and responsiveness in the European Union as a kind of multi-level system. So the interplay, let's say, between national institutions and actors and the European ones. And this book kind of really wants to make the reader think outside of our usual fault lines that we oftentimes tend to have in European studies on what national interests are, what European interests are, and how they kind of relate to each other. And at the time, let's say the first idea for the project came about, I was actually working as a policy advisor in the European division at the German Federal Chancellery in Berlin. This was actually at the height of the Eurozone crisis, so the sovereign debt crisis. And I realized somehow that many public discussions and also discussions I had with colleagues there were kind of revolving around, let's say, two forces pulling into two different directions. There was very much awareness of the economic interdependence at the time, things happening in one member state very rapidly and had far-reaching consequences, let's say, on the fates and fortunes of citizens living in other EU countries. But at the same time, there was also a lot of politicization going on, a lot of reservations towards many of these measures taken. So this was basically the background where I started with the question, what do these things do, let's say, not only to the way that national politicians do politics, but maybe at a deeper level, what does this do to their representation in the European context? And the main question or argument, I guess you could say, of the book then is, and I look at members of national parliaments, who do they represent when they make such decisions in a European Union context? Do they really only speak for their national citizens? Or do they also take into account citizens that live in other member states, or maybe even an overarching European citizenry? And the book then tries to make both theoretically and you could say probably also a bit normatively the case why this may be an interesting new way of thinking about representation that goes a bit beyond our usual standard notion that we have of representation when we think about national parliaments in an EU context, namely pretty much only focusing on national concerns and what their national citizens want. And then what this book also does, I guess this is the second part of the argument, is really looking at this empirically by combining different data sources. I wanted to combine, more quantitative data on the one hand, but also with more qualitative data to kind of really understand these patterns of representation that we have. And I analyze parliamentary debates on key decision cases in European integration because I wanted to start with, okay, what do these national parliamentarians say publicly? Who do they represent when they make decisions on the Greek bailout or on other EU integration questions? And then I thought, okay, maybe that's one side of things, but I want to get at this a bit deeper. I want to really understand not only what they say publicly, maybe, but also at a kind of deeper level, what do they think? And that's why I also conducted 66 interviews with members of parliaments in Austria, Germany, Ireland, and the UK, who at the time I did this was still a member of the European Union.
But before you started the work, did you have any reason to believe that there would be these different patterns of representation, or did the empirical work reveal this to you?
I guess, to be completely honest, I had the idea that, or I had the hunch that there was something to this idea of broader representative roles that I wanted to look at, not only kind of thinking about national parliaments and members of national parliament as kind of being elected by national citizens and then only representing their concerns. So I also, from my work in the Chancellery and with the German Bundestag specifically, I somehow had the idea that there may be something to this, some broader understanding of representation that also the actors would share. But at the very beginning of the project, when I talked to academic colleagues about this, they immediately thought, when I told them what I was going to do, they immediately thought I was going to look at the European Parliament. And it didn't even seem to occur to them that this was something that could happen in national parliaments to start with. So in a sense, I guess it goes to show how ingrained even in European scholars, this idea is that national parliaments are kind of like the gatekeepers of European integrations, kind of like the guardians of, let's say, national interests only. And I was a bit worried at the beginning whether, if scholars didn't even think this was going to happen, then the politicians that I was interested in may also not do that. But I was actually quite surprised then to find the amount of representative claims to other EU citizens in the plenary debates, and then later also in the interviews that I did find. I think I was most surprised, you could say, by that this was actually something that was happening systematically. It did not seem to be, neither in the debates that I looked at and also not in the interviews, some kind of, I don't know, random noise that they would just, occasionally refer to the interests of Greek citizens, for example. But this was really something that was happening quite a bit. And it somehow seemed to be, again, not an either or decision in a sense. Should it be national citizens that are represented, or should there be some kind of European representation? But the members of parliament really seem to somehow mix and match the different claims to representation. So on the one hand, the national electoral connection was not lost, or let's say, I don't know, superimposed by a European one, but we could clearly see that they were trying to reconcile the different interests in a kind of not a zero-sum game logic. They were not thinking along the lines, okay, for some to win, others must lose, but they were really trying to consider these different interests and not only exclusively, let's say, focus on the national interest.
Well, you actually do find it with your research that German MPs were, as you quote, very inclined to Europeanize their representation, while the British were reluctant to. So we can come back to the British later. But do you think, well, first of all, how do you explain that particularity of German MPs? And second, do you think perhaps you wouldn't have had the inspiration for the book had you not been working in Berlin at the time?
That's probably true. Starting with the second part of the question, you're probably right. The German MPs that I talked to, and also the debates that I looked at, were quite puzzling to me, I have to say, because I would say they had the most kind of multi-layered, but also complex understanding of representation in EU affairs, it seemed. So they were, like you said, by far the most consistently Europeanized, both in what they said, whom they represent in the plenary debates, but also when I talked to them in the interviews. And my impression was, especially from the interviews, that this was something that really had something to do with their notion of what the national interest is. Many talked to me also very personally about, especially after the World War, that the notion of a German national interest was somehow inseparably tied to European integration. And most of them kind of argued along the lines, German national interest is something like, if Europe is doing well, then Germany is also doing well, and Europe is basically in the German national interest. And of course, you could say that's also probably quite a strategic argument to make, knowing, Germany profits very well from the single market with the export-led growth strategy and these things. But I had a feeling from the interviews that there was a bit more to it. First of all, I thought this was something that they had actually really thought about, this European dimension of representation. It was not something that I prompted them with. I basically just asked them, who do you represent in EU affairs? And they talked about their national interests, but they almost immediately went to the broader European interests, or also taking the interests of other citizens into consideration. And I also had one final question that I asked everyone that was kind of a dreamer's question, you could say. I asked them if you could have one wish, completely free of any chains of what is politically feasible, a purely hypothetical scenario. And I asked them, what would you want to change institutionally in the European Union? I wanted to get a bit at their visions for Europe. And the German MPs, particularly, not only, but especially, they really advocated for a very active role of national parliaments, but not only with regard to national interests, but really with a broader European outlook. Some of them even went as far as suggesting to maybe abolish national parliaments in the long run. But what you could actually see, it was not, in their heads at least, it seemed, not the usual dichotomy of, it's either the United States of Europe or, we have to rescale things back to the nation state. But they really had very interesting ideas of how to actually reconcile national concerns with wider European ones. And I think this has a lot to do also with historical experiences and with a particularly German, I guess you could say, notion of what the national interest is.
Yeah. And I mean, this focus on national parliaments and your relegation of the European Parliament, and you actually refer to it as, quote, a second-order locus of political identification and collective will formation. I mean, that, as you touched on earlier, that's not a fashionable position in the academic world, and certainly not if you're in the European Parliament. How did this go down? Was there pushback against this approach?
Yeah, that's probably true. Not a very fashionable stance to take. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there are many great EU scholars that do focus on the European Parliament when it comes to representation, when it comes to questions of responsiveness, and I think it is a very worthwhile endeavor to do that. I think we can learn a lot about the question. Okay, who do members of the European Parliament represent? Are they driven, let's say, by their national principles, or do they, further some kind of wider European interest? In a sense, kind of, do they Europeanize? Is there some kind of socialization into a more European thinking, let's say? And I think we find interesting tendencies here. I deliberately kind of chose to focus on national parliaments and look at some kind of European representation among members of national parliaments, precisely because maybe at first this really seems like the unlikely place to look for that. Because really what the standard account of representation and the role of national parliaments is national representatives get elected by national citizens, and then they represent their concerns also in European Union affairs. And I really had the feeling that this was a kind of too narrow understanding of the representative role of national parliaments. And I also think there are good reasons to assume that national parliaments can actually take this broader role when making decisions on transnational problems that do cut across national borders. I think a lot of times we tend to look at the institutions and their formal roles, and then there are usually these two options. It's some form of supranationalization, or it's some more intergovernmental cooperation, and there seems to be nothing in between. And my idea of looking at national parliaments was, in a sense, to open up a third way in which national parliaments can have a more, not always kind of being the veto players in European integration, but have a more open European representative role, you could say. And maybe as a final point, I don't see it, and I think we should not see it, again, as an either or decision. It's either about strengthening the European Parliament or strengthening the national parliaments. And I think my book shows this empirically as well, because the actors kind of show it, that it really can be both. So whenever I talk to colleagues and they were kind of, questioning this, I always try to make the case that this should and cannot be an either-or decision, either strengthening, let's say, the European Parliament or focusing on national parliaments in that way.
I mean, I've got to say, I have a natural sympathy for the idea, given what I think is a structural problem with the European Parliament, that as long as you have the European Union built around a Council of Ministers and a treaty-based organisation between governments, you're always going to have European Parliament elections falling between national elections, except in Belgium. And that means they're always going to be a venue for protest votes. Extreme parties do very well, and then the European Parliament acts as a sort of incubator for extremism that's then re-imported back into nation states, and we've seen this many, many times. Do you have? I guess do you share that approach, or is your approach much more kind of objective than perhaps mine is?
No, I think I agree. I mean, this is one of the problems, let's say in quotation mark, that we have. You put your finger right on it. This idea of kind of spill back also to the national arena, where we see this right wing populist tendencies, and I wouldn't go as far as saying my approach is a kind of antidote to this, or a kind of silver bullet solving all the problems that we have with the crises of representation at the EU level and also at the national level. But I think, for one, opening scholars' eyes to this that is already happening, in a sense, it doesn't really need, let's say, cumbersome institutional changes or treaty changes to kind of tackle the democratic deficit in that sense. But it's already something that, to quite a surprising degree, is actually happening in the day-to-day politics in the national parliaments. And just for scholars and also others to kind of become aware of this and maybe factor this in, rather than going to the go-to solutions that we usually do, I think this can be a good complement. And I'm sure we're probably going to talk a bit also about the different parties, how they do this European representation in the national parliaments.
Yeah, we certainly are. But first, I'd like to, this is relevant to that. The second chapter of your book, the sort of theoretical foundations for the book, you make this crucial differentiation between legislators' roles and their role orientations. Can you explain this concept and its importance to your argument?
I think this goes back to pretty early research on representative roles and parliamentary roles, actually coming from the US context, from the 50s and the 60s. So Walker and others were the first to kind of coin these terms, you could say, because they felt the need. They also analyzed legislators in the US Congress, and they kind of felt the need to make the distinction between, on the one hand, the so-called representative roles, kind of what legislators do, the kind of roles they play, you could say. So this could, in fact, be purely strategic. And a lot of people, when they talk about these roles, they kind of come up with a theater metaphor. It's about playing these representative roles, also playing them publicly, and they may be purely strategic. And then on the other hand, and this goes a bit deeper, is the concept of role orientations. And that's kind of going at the, let's say, deeper convictions or the underlying ideas of these MPs. Who do they think they are as a representative? And ultimately, whose interests do they feel they probably should represent? And for my book, I found this very basic distinction quite helpful, because it, in a sense, allowed me to get at what they say and what they think, and combine this with the different methods that I used. And when I think about it, I think both are equally important. I guess one problem when you analyze public speech behavior is this could all be cheap talk. This could, in the end, probably all be, national interests kind of sugar-coated with some Europeanness. In a sense, we also care about, let's say, the Greek citizens during the Eurozone crisis. But even if, I guess, this was only purely strategic, I think the pure fact of publicly bringing in the grievances of these foreign citizens, let's say, into the domestic debate and also into the domestic will formation process on EU affairs, does something to the way representation is done. So a plenary debate, let's say, that, focuses on the German interests in, I don't know, the common agricultural policy, would look very different from one that includes the interests of the Irish turf cutters, British fishers, or, let's say, Austrian farmers. So I think this goes to say that even if, worst case scenario, they didn't believe a word they were saying, it still, does something publicly to the way representation is done in national parliaments in EU affairs. And luckily, I was quite happy about that. In the interviews, I do find, some traces that this is something that actually goes a bit deeper and is not just purely strategic.
Well, and this is relevant to this. I mean, your most striking finding, and it seemed to surprise you, is that MPs from the extreme left tend to be the most Europeanized in terms of representation. But I was going to ask, isn't this simply, do you think, because they hold to an ideology that is necessarily internationalist in character, and their representation of these non-citizens is almost an accident of that ideology?
I actually thought a lot about this point as well. It's this notion that I called Eurosceptic Europeanization in a sense that the left-leaning MPs, also from the mainstream left, but particularly, like you say, from the far left, actually show these Europeanized representation patterns most consistently and also most strongly. So on the one hand, yes, I would say it does have something to do with their ideological leaning, because, like you said, they have this broader internationalist outlook. And we see that on the reverse, let's say, on the right side of the political spectrum, which is also, I guess, quite intuitive, because far-right parties would naturally have this national outlook. So I would say the general left-right pattern is maybe not so surprising after all. The much more fascinating or also surprising part for me was actually the Eurosceptic part. That it's not the mainstream left or the pro-EU mainstream parties, also from the center-right, that are the strongest drivers of this European representation. And I think this this maybe again be some kind of automatic thinking that we have, that pro-European parties should naturally also be the ones that have particularly European patterns of representation. And in fact, when I started out the project, this was one of my very first expectations that in the end, I could not at all confirm. So you could say that my most interesting finding, in a sense, is a kind of non-finding, because what we see, and then I ended up finding this quite fascinating, is that Eurosceptic parties from the left, like the Left Party in Germany, and there were some Irish members of parliament, independent members of parliament from the left, that really had these Europeanized patterns of representation, while, let's say, conservative Austrian or German parliamentarians from pro-EU parties, they spoke more in the name of national citizens. So I guess simply put, you could say, maybe taking the risk of, maybe a bit oversimplifying now, but pro-EU center-right parties speak about the good of the European Union for national citizens, while Eurosceptic far left ones kind of criticized the EU in the name of European citizens. And then, of course, there's a lot of questions. What kind of representation is this? If it's, a lot of opposition to European integration projects, and whether this is some desirable form of representation or not.
Do you think perhaps if you were to update your research to I don't know, say the last couple of years, where this illiberal wave has come through from Hungary and Poland, and there's been this quite strong liberal pushback from what would be traditionally considered the liberal centre or the liberal centre right, and I don't include the EPP here. I'm thinking of the liberal parties. Do you think perhaps that would also show an increased representation of non-citizens that is not showing up in your research, which is inevitably a little bit older?
I think that would be a very interesting thing to actually update this and look at newer debates and maybe do newer interviews, because a lot of things changed quite rapidly. And I could think that I could actually find something like this in a way that, because of, in a kind of reaction also to illiberal trends and, more and more rise of populist far right parties, that let's say I call them mainstream pro-European parties, the center-left and the center-right parties, would take up this European notion of representation. Because it's not, in my data, it's not the case that they don't do it at all, but they were driving this less than I had originally expected. And maybe this would be really, really interesting to see. And I think we could find something like this, that they now kind of pick this up in terms of the competition or the threat to liberal democracy becoming stronger over the past years. So that would be indeed a very, very new future research project to do.
In this respect, and also what you've described, do you think there is a developing European demos? I mean, this is one of the criticisms made in the UK about the European Union, that there was no real demos. Do you think there is one? And if there isn't, do you think it matters?
The big demos question. It seems kind of be looming behind my entire project, although I don't really address it so much up front in the book. From the data that I have collected and also the interviews that I've conducted, what I found very striking, and there was also quite a big difference between how British members of Parliament responded as compared to the others, was that in the back of their minds, it was not so much the question, even when we were talking about the Eurozone crisis and the bailout mechanisms, it was not so much questions about redistribution and the kind of, economic questions of who gets what, but what they were really concerned about when they thought about representation was rather the question of who belongs to us, who is part of the political community, and in a European Union context, where are the boundaries of this political community if we have things like the Eurozone crisis and other crises that follows, obviously, maybe have a similar logic, where the problems don't stop at the national borders. So I had the feeling that it was at least something, this whole idea of, is there a European demos? Is there a common European identity, or let's say some form of shared political community? I felt this was something they had thought about. This was something they had clear stances about. Some people clearly said this is something that is in the making and it should be. And others, especially from the populist far-right parties, they clearly had a very different understanding of what the national interest is, what sovereignty is, and said there cannot be a European demos and there should not be one. So I think just the fact that, these politicians that are usually in the day-to-day kind of politics game of things, that they took the time to consider these bigger questions, kind of goes to show that there is something happening around the question, not only the economic question of who gets what, but ultimately also the question of who belongs to our shared community and who doesn't.
Well, at the end of the book, you come to the big normative question: can Europeanized parliaments be an antidote to the EU's democratic deficit? And the answer you give is probably yes. But then you then ask two more questions: should they be, and are they a stepping stone to transnational democracy? Now, I know the book wasn't really the venue for coming up with solutions to this. It was more an analysis, but I was really intrigued as to what your potential solutions would be. What is the answer to probably yes?
There were a lot of maybes and probablys in the final chapter. I think a couple of answers and maybe also a suggestion that would come to my mind. I think, for one, what is really important, that national parliaments will always be, and should probably always be, also venues of national representation. So this whole idea of them also considering European citizens, citizens living in other member states, I wouldn't see it as kind of doing away with the national electoral connection, because I think a lot of, political identification and also domestic will formation is firmly anchored at the national level, and that's fine. I think by opening up our view on national parliaments, we kind of see, and this has been quite overlooked, how they can supplement, let's say, with these European patterns of representation towards a kind of transnational democracy in the day-to-day of politics, rather than having these big institutional reforms. And one thing that probably is kind of in the back of all of this is the question of whether citizens, is this a kind of representation that citizens actually want? And I think that's a crucial argument, in a sense that if the national citizens also want their national representatives to have, these European citizens represented, then that's a different, maybe more durable variant of this kind of representation, as if it was only driven by these national politicians themselves. And another question that is then kind of connected to that is the question of accountability to these foreign citizens. I mean, in a way, it's nice if German citizens want their members of parliament to represent the Greeks, but I think the more difficult question is actually, do the Greeks want the German parliamentarians to represent them as well? And this is not entirely unproblematic, in a sense, because the kind of representation we see here may be, quite parochial, or maybe even some kind of bad representation. So I think then ultimately the question arises, okay, maybe there has to be some kind of institutional underpinning, some kind of institutional innovation we can do to have these transnational connections in a more formalized way. And a lot of people like Joachim Blatter have worked on this, the idea of extension of the voting rights. In a sense, me, being a German living in Austria, I can obviously vote locally in Austria and the EP, of course. But the national elections, I cannot take part in. So one idea would be to kind of really reconsider these old notions of citizenship and territoriality, maybe to think about these voting rights. Another idea that I probably didn't touch upon in the book would be less hard to change, but maybe some combination of representative approaches to democracy with more, let's say, deliberative or participatory approaches. So I'm thinking along the lines of maybe having some transnational digital platforms where citizens from one member state can interact with politicians from other member states. I mean, there have always been these ideas floating around. There again, a problem that arises would be, how elitist are these platforms? Are they just for the young urban professionals who are, tend not to be underrepresented in European politics? So I think there are a lot of ideas floating out there. Now it seems my answer was maybe again, but...
No, there were some good ideas there. Another that occurred to me, and you touch on it in the first chapter about the development of COSAC, the committee of committees, right, of the national European affairs committees. Given how relatively quickly the European Union was able to set up representative bodies like the ECSC or the Committee of the Regions, do you think it would make sense to formally do something with COSAC to make it something that has more say in the development of legislation and keeping an oversight of the Council of Ministers?
Mm-hmm. I think purely from a let's say, theoretical perspective, there would be some arguments for that in a sense. I mean, and this has been, discussed also in academic debates, but also in more public policy circles. I think this idea of could COSAC not only in quotation marks be kind of a forum for information exchange, but really, have a more kind of stronger legislative function in terms of policy making, and maybe also, like you said, the control function, scrutinizing as a common body, let's say, what happens in the different EU institutions, and especially the Council of Ministers. And I think my colleague Ian Cooper has called this the kind of virtual third chamber. In a sense, can national parliaments assume this role and become this virtual third chamber kind of at the European level? Just from talking to the members of parliament, I'm skeptical that this is what they would advocate for. I also asked them what functions or which tasks they thought their national parliaments should fulfill. And whenever we talked about, COSAC having a more formal role, and there were not many differences between the countries either. They basically said, yeah, this would be nice to have, but we don't think it's politically feasible for one, and maybe that's not the best venue to do this kind of control and oversight. This should rather stay with the national parliaments as individual parliaments, kind of controlling their national government. So they had a very strong focus on their own scrutiny role and their own role in EU affairs, and didn't really think so much about these possibilities to connect this. But then again, I only looked at these four countries, and this was also a while ago. I think since then, this whole discussion of what to do with interparliamentary cooperation, also, in relation to matters of economic governance, and the monetary union has really picked up in recent years. So probably, if I talk to them again today, I would probably get a different answer.
Right. Okay. Well, to finish the interview, since this is a podcast about books, I've asked you to come up with 2 books to recommend. What have you chosen?
So for the book that's kind of broadly from my field, let's say, I've chosen a book by Alvaro Olear that was published in 2021, also by Palgrave. It's called Framing TTIP in the European Public Spheres Towards an Empowering Dissensus for EU Integration. And what he does very well, and what I very much like about this book, he looks at the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, and he kind of disentangles, let's say, the different dynamics of politicization as kind of a part of, almost normalizing European Union politics, and maybe actually enhancing democratic legitimacy in the European Union. So he looks at different media debates and the different public spheres that are usually, very nationally segmented. And he kind of traces the different Europeanization patterns in these public spheres. And I think that speaks very well to my side that looks at, let's say, the parliament side of this, because he kind of also concludes that there's not only a bad kind of politicization, and the public dissensus on European integration does not always have to be constraining, but it can actually be quite empowering, at least with regard to TTIP that he looks at. And for the other book, I chose Jenny Odell's How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy. It's a very tough, but I think very rewarding read. So maybe it's not your usual summer beach read. And the title suggests a bit, that at first I thought when I picked it up, this is kind of like a self-care book or kind of like a self-help book, but it's really not so much about, spending your free time in a way to, to self-optimize or kind of be productive afterwards. But she really makes an interesting case to genuinely do nothing. And she draws on insights from philosophy, arts, also a lot on political thought and political philosophy. And I found that very refreshing.
Right. Well, excellent choices. Today I've been talking to Lucy Kinski about European representation in EU national parliaments, published this year by Palgrave Macmillan and shortlisted for the UAC's Best Book Prize. Lucy, thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks. It was a pleasure.